There is a particular silence that falls over a room the moment someone realizes they have been too radiant for the people around them. It is not a loud silence. It rarely announces itself with confrontation or accusation. It arrives instead as a subtle absence, a friend who no longer calls after good news, a partner whose praise curdles into criticism, a family member whose eyes narrow slightly whenever joy is spoken aloud without apology. And in that silence, a question begins to form that most people spend a lifetime avoiding. Why does my light seem to cost me the very people I thought it would draw closer? Before this goes further, if any part of this question has ever lived quietly inside you, let the like button be your way of marking it, and let subscribing be your way of making sure the next piece of this understanding finds you when you are ready for it. What follows is not comfort in the easy sense, it is recognition. And recognition, as will become clear, is a far more dangerous gift to receive than comfort ever was. Carl Jung spent the better part of his life studying a phenomenon so quiet, so deeply embedded in ordinary relationships, that most people mistake it for personal misfortune rather than psychological law. He noticed that the people most often punished in social and intimate life were rarely the cruel, the cold, or the indifferent. They were, more often, the warm, the emotionally honest, the intuitively generous, the ones who had somehow managed to remain undivided in a world that teaches division as survival. And Jung asked a question that modern psychology, obsessed with diagnosing the sufferer rather than the source, still largely avoids. What is it about wholeness that provokes such quiet violence in those who have lost it? To understand this, it becomes necessary to abandon the comforting fiction that most adults are simply themselves, that the person standing in front of you, speaking, smiling, offering opinions, is a complete and accurate representation of who they actually are. Jung's clinical work suggested something far less comfortable. He proposed that nearly every adult walking through the world is, in some essential way, a fragment. Not because they are broken in any dramatic sense, but because the process of growing up in a family, a culture, a society, demands a kind of quiet amputation. Certain qualities are rewarded, certain qualities are punished, and the child, desperate above all else to remain loved, begins to perform surgery on their own soul long before they understand what surgery means. He called the result of this process the persona, a word borrowed deliberately from the ancient theater, where actors wore masks not to conceal their faces but to announce, clearly and publicly, which role they were playing. The persona is not a lie, exactly. It is closer to a costume worn so long that its wearer forgets there is a body underneath it. It is built from approval. From every moment a parent smiled at obedience and frowned at defiance. Every moment a teacher praised quiet compliance and punished disruptive honesty. Every moment society rewarded the performance of strength and quietly shamed the performance of vulnerability. Brick by brick, expectation by expectation, the persona is constructed, and by the time most people reach adulthood, they no longer experience it as a mask at all, they experience it as themselves. But nothing disappears simply because it has been forbidden. This is the second and more devastating half of Jung's discovery. Whatever a person amputates from their conscious identity does not vanish from the psyche. It descends, it gathers, layer upon layer, into a region Jung called the shadow, not evil in the way religious tradition has taught the word, but simply unlit, unseen, unintegrated. The shadow is not the opposite of goodness. It is the opposite of consciousness. It contains whatever a person could not afford to know about themselves and survive their childhood intact. Picture, for a moment, the child who cried easily and was told, again and again, that crying was weakness, that big boys don't cry, that girls who cry too much are dramatic and exhausting to be around. That child does not stop feeling grief, they simply stop showing it, and somewhere in the depths of their unconscious, an entire capacity for open emotional expression is folded away, locked behind a door the child themselves eventually forgets exists. Picture the child who was naturally generous, who wanted to give freely, and who was mocked for being naive, told that generosity makes a person a target, that kindness is a currency to be spent carefully, if at all. That child grows into an adult who calculates every act of warmth, suspicious of their own softness, having buried generosity itself in the unlit region of the shadow. Now picture what happens when that adult, guarded and calculating and quietly grieving a self they can no longer remember, encounters someone who never learned to perform that particular amputation, someone who cries without apology, someone who gives freely without calculating the cost, someone who has, through some combination of temperament, upbringing, or hard-won healing, remained closer to wholeness than most people ever manage. Jung understood, with unusual precision, what happens in that encounter, and it is rarely the reunion one might hope for. The encounter does not feel like inspiration to the wounded party. It feels like accusation, not because the light-bearer has said or done anything accusatory, but because their very existence functions as evidence, undeniable, walking, breathing evidence, that the amputation was never actually necessary, that the suppression, the calculation, the guardedness was a choice extracted by fear rather than a fact demanded by reality. And there is very little the human ego finds more unbearable than proof that its own suffering was, at least in part, avoidable. This is the mechanism Jung named projection, though the clinical term does a disservice to how visceral and immediate the experience actually is. Projection is not a deliberate act of malice. It is closer to psychological reflex, the unconscious relocation of an unbearable internal truth onto an external target, so that the truth can be criticized, controlled, or destroyed outside the self instead of grieved within it. The person who has buried their own softness does not consciously think, "I envy your gentleness, and this envy terrifies me, so I will call it weakness instead." The mind is far more efficient than that. It simply produces the judgment fully formed. She is too sensitive, he is too soft, they are too much. And the judgment feels, to the person producing it, like clear-eyed observation, rather than the defensive maneuver it actually is. This is why the wound so often disguises itself as concern. "I'm just being honest with you," says the person whose honesty is, in fact, the sound of their own shadow defending its territory. "You need to toughen up," says the parent who long ago buried their own tenderness beneath layers of survival, now horrified to watch a child refuse to bury theirs. "You're too idealistic," says the friend, who once believed in something and was punished badly enough for it, that belief itself became, for them, a kind of humiliation they cannot bear to witness in someone else without flinching. If you have lived this, and if you are watching this, some quiet part of you almost certainly has. You likely spent years believing the criticism contained some kernel of truth about you, that your sensitivity really was excessive, that your generosity really was naive, that your emotional honesty really was, as you were told, too much for the people around you to bear. Understand this clearly, because it will not be repeated with this same directness again. Their discomfort with your wholeness was never evidence of a flaw in you. It was evidence of a wound in them, projected outward because it was easier to attack a mirror than to grieve what the mirror revealed. Jung described a psychological law that governs this entire dynamic with unusual precision, a principle he borrowed from the language of ancient Greek philosophy and renamed enantiodromia, the tendency of anything pushed to its extreme to eventually become its own opposite. A person who suppresses grief long enough does not remain simply unemotional. Given enough suppression, they often become actively hostile toward emotional expression in others, because that expression has become, in their unconscious architecture, a direct threat to the fragile equilibrium they have built. A person who buries generosity does not remain neutral about generosity. They frequently become cynical about it, suspicious of it, quick to interpret it as manipulation or foolishness, because genuine generosity, witnessed up close, threatens to reopen a door they spent years sealing shut. This is the answer to a question that torments so many emotionally open people. Why does it always seem to be the people closest to me, the ones who claim to love me, who sought me out, who once told me my warmth was what drew them in, who eventually become the ones working hardest to extinguish it? Enantiodromia explains what indifference cannot. Strangers rarely resent your light, because strangers have no proximity to the parts of themselves your light disturbs. It is only intimacy, closeness, love, sustained exposure that creates enough friction between your wholeness and their fragmentation to produce this particular, quiet cruelty. There is a dream, Jung, recorded from a woman in analysis, a dream that has since become one of the clearest illustrations of exactly this dynamic. She dreamed she stood in a garden as evening fell, the light thick and golden, the air heavy with the smell of turned soil. Around her, in every direction, stood trees, dozens of them, their branches bare, their bark cracked and gray, though the ground beneath them was rich and dark, clearly capable of nourishing far more than what grew there. At the center of the garden stood a single tree, unlike the others, its branches heavy with fruit that seemed to glow faintly from within, as though lit by some source deeper than the setting sun. She approached it, intending, as she described it, not to keep the fruit for myself, but to share it, because it felt wrong to have so much when everything around me had so little. As she reached to pick the fruit, the barren trees began to lean toward her, not gently, their branches, dry and brittle, scraped against her arms as she reached, drawing thin lines of blood she did not notice until she woke. She told Jung she had expected, on waking, to feel fear. Instead, she felt something closer to grief, an overwhelming, inexplicable sorrow for the barren trees themselves, as though some part of her understood, even in sleep, that their scraping was not hatred, but hunger. Jung's interpretation of this dream reached far beyond the woman's individual circumstances, because the image itself speaks a language nearly universal in the human unconscious. The barren trees, he explained, were not enemies in any moral sense. They were images of unlived life, of potential once present, now withered through years of suppression, denial, or simple neglect. Their reaching toward the fruit-bearing tree was not an act of malice, but an act of desperate, unconscious hunger, the body's memory of what it once might have grown, reaching instinctively toward what still could. And the blood on the woman's arms, Jung suggested, was simply the cost, often unfair, rarely deserved, of standing fully alive in a garden full of the half-alive. If this image feels uncomfortably familiar, if you have felt scraped raw by people who claim to want closeness with you while working, in ways too subtle to name outright, to keep you smaller, you are not imagining the wound. You have simply been standing exactly where the woman in the dream stood, abundant, undivided, surrounded by soil capable of so much more than what was growing in it. This raises a question that must be asked honestly, because there is a real danger in stopping the understanding here, a danger of using this knowledge only to catalog the wounds of others, while quietly excusing oneself from any responsibility at all. Jung would never have allowed this story to end there, because his entire psychology was built on a far more demanding premise, that the discovery of another person's shadow means nothing if it does not also illuminate something about the shape of one's own. And so it must be asked, gently but without evasion, what happens inside a person who is repeatedly punished for their light? What does years of being scraped raw by barren branches actually do to someone who was never given a name for what was happening to them? For a great many people, the answer is a slow, almost invisible act of self-erasure. They do not decide, in any single dramatic moment, to become smaller. It happens gradually, the way a river reshapes a landscape, not through any single event, but through the accumulated pressure of 10,000 small ones. They learn to soften the excitement in their voice before sharing good news, having felt, one time too many, the strange chill that follows joy shared too openly. They learn to qualify their intuition before speaking it aloud, saying, "This might sound strange, but," as a kind of preemptive apology for a perception they have learned to distrust in the presence of others, even when it has proven, time and again, to be accurate. They learn to give less freely, not because their capacity for generosity has diminished, but because they have grown weary of watching generosity mistaken for weakness, or worse, exploited by people who sensed, correctly, that it would never run out. This is not growth. This is not the wisdom of maturity that people often mistake it for. This is what Jung would recognize immediately as a wound disguising itself as adaptation, the undivided self, exhausted by repeated projection and punishment, beginning to construct its own persona in self-defense, brick by careful brick, until the very radiance that once made a person unmistakable becomes indistinguishable from the crowd of half-lit people surrounding them. If you recognize this pattern in the architecture of your own life, if you can trace, across years or even decades, a quiet and steady dimming, a retreat from the fullness you once embodied before the world taught you the cost of embodying it, this is the moment to stop moving forward on autopilot and look directly at what has happened, because Jung believed something that stands in direct opposition to the despair this realization can produce. He believed the psyche does not annihilate what it buries. It preserves it, imperfectly, often painfully, but it preserves it nonetheless, the way soil preserves a seed through even the harshest winter, waiting only for conditions to shift. There is a second dream, one Jung returned to often in his own reflections on the process he called individuation, and it belongs not to a patient, but to his broader meditation on what he termed the self, not the ego, not the curated persona presented to the world, but the deep organizing center of the entire psyche, the blueprint of wholeness a person carries even when they have spent a lifetime living as though it does not exist. In this image, a man walks through a house unfamiliar to him, though something in its architecture suggests it has always belonged to him. Room after room reveals nothing unusual, furniture draped in dust cloths, windows clouded with age, the ordinary debris of a life lived carelessly. But in the deepest room, the one furthest from the entrance, he finds a chest, its wood dark and swollen with age, its lock rusted shut. And from the cracks between its boards, a faint golden light escapes, pulsing gently, as though something inside it were not merely glowing but breathing. He does not know, in the dream, what the chest contains. He knows only that the light disturbs him in a way he cannot name, not with fear, but with a longing so old and so buried that he has no immediate language for it. He tries the lock. It does not give. He presses his palm against the wood instead, and in that gesture, something in him settles, as though mere proximity to the light were enough, for now, to begin some slow work he does not yet understand. Jung read this image as one of the clearest representations available of what waits inside every person who has ever been told, by the world or by the people meant to love them, that some essential part of them was too much to be allowed to exist freely. The chest is never foreign material smuggled in from outside. It is not something to be acquired, purchased, or borrowed from anyone else's wholeness. It is already there, already inside the house, already inside the person, glowing faintly, even in its imprisonment, patient, in a way human impatience rarely allows itself to understand. The rust on the lock is not proof that the light has died. It is only proof of how long it has been left untouched. This is the deeper truth beneath every act of resentment this narration has described tonight. What others reject in you, your softness, your intuition, your generosity, your refusal to calculate love before offering it, is never proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof, instead, that something in you remains alive, alive enough, undivided enough, to disturb people who let the same capacity die quietly in themselves long ago. The chest glows, precisely because it was never fully extinguished, and no amount of scraping branches, no amount of cold withdrawal disguised as boundaries, no amount of mockery wearing the mask of honesty has ever succeeded in putting out a light that was never built from anyone else's approval to begin with. It is here, standing at the threshold of this recognition, that the archetype waiting beneath this entire pattern begins to reveal its shape, and it is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest images the human psyche has ever produced, carried forward through myth, long before psychology gave it clinical language. It is the archetype Jung called the wounded healer, drawn from the ancient story of Chiron, the centaur who carried an incurable wound of his own, and yet became, precisely because of that wound, the greatest healer his world had ever known. Chiron did not teach medicine despite his suffering. He taught it because of what his suffering had shown him, the exact geography of pain, mapped from the inside, in a way no untouched healer could ever access. The wounded healer does not shine because life spared them. They shine because life did not, and still they refuse to let the wound calcify into cruelty. Their warmth is not naivete. It is not the untested optimism of someone who has never suffered. It is scar tissue, transformed through some long and difficult alchemy into a source of light for others, still standing in the dark they themselves once occupied. This is the archetype quietly awakening in anyone who has ever been punished for their sensitivity and chosen, again and again, despite every incentive to harden, to remain open instead. If you have spent years believing your emotional depth was a liability the world simply tolerated rather than valued, consider instead what Jung would have seen in you, not a burden, but evidence. Evidence that suffering did not succeed in doing to you what it has done to so many others. Evidence that somewhere along the way, perhaps in a moment you do not even consciously remember, you made a choice to remain undivided when division would have been so much easier, so much safer, so much more rewarded by the people around you. This is not weakness. Jung would have named this among the rarest and most demanding accomplishments the psyche is capable of. To carry real wounds without becoming, in turn, a source of wounding for others. Those who resent your light, understood through this lens, cease to be villains in any simple sense. However genuine the pain their behavior has caused you, they become, instead, wanderers still lost inside their own unlit gardens, scraping instinctively at whatever fruit passes close enough to reach, starving in soil that could still, under different conditions, bear something of their own. To hate them accomplishes nothing but adding one more fracture to a world already saturated with fracture. But to protect your own light from their reaching, to finally stop apologizing for its presence, stop dimming it in anticipation of their discomfort, stop treating your own wholeness as something requiring their permission, this is not cruelty toward them. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the long, often solitary, frequently painful process of becoming, at last, who you actually are, rather than who fear once trained you to perform. There is a further layer to this archetype worth sitting with, because the wounded healer is not the only mythic identity waiting inside this particular pattern of experience. Jung also spoke of what mystical and religious traditions across cultures have called the twice-born, those who undergo not merely physical birth, but a second, psychological birth, one that occurs only through the crucible of real suffering. The first birth is given. The second must be earned, and it is earned precisely through the kind of experience this narration has spent its length describing, the repeated encounter with rejection for one's own undivided nature, and the refusal, despite every wound, to let that rejection dictate the shape of the self. Those who resent you have, in most cases, undergone only the first birth. They remain psychologically unfinished, still governed by the fears instilled in them long before they had any capacity to examine those fears critically. You, if you have survived their resentment without abandoning your own depth, may already be closer to the second birth than you realize. This is not a claim of superiority. Jung would have been the first to warn against turning this understanding into a hierarchy, a new way of dividing the world into the awakened and the unawakened. because that division is simply the ego performing its oldest trick under a more sophisticated disguise. It is, instead, a recognition, quiet, private, requiring no audience, that suffering, met without hardening, changes the very architecture of a person's inner life. Here, then, is the line worth carrying long after this narration ends, the truth beneath every instance of resentment described tonight, the one sentence Jung's entire body of work seems to circle without ever stating quite this plainly: they did not resent you for being too much. They resented you for reminding them of everything they were too afraid to become. Let that settle fully before moving forward, because it reorganizes the entire meaning of what has been endured. It means the ache carried through years of being punished for kindness, the exhaustion of shrinking to keep others comfortable, the quiet grief of watching warmth mistaken again and again for weakness. None of it was ever a referendum on your worth. It was, in every case, a reflection of someone else's unlived life, refracted through their fear and handed to you as though it were yours to carry. It never was. It was never yours at all. Return, one final time, to the garden. Not to the moment of the scraping branches, but to what might happen afterward, once the woman in the dream understands what her wound actually meant. Imagine her standing in that same garden the following evening, the light falling the same thick, heavy gold across the same rich soil. Imagine the barren trees still there, still reaching, still hungry, in the same unconscious way. But imagine her, this time, not flinching from their reach, not hiding the fruit, not apologizing for having grown where others withered, simply remaining, rooted, undivided, fully lit from within, offering what she has to whoever is capable of receiving it, without shrinking to accommodate those who are not. The barren trees may never change. Some wounds, Jung understood with a clarity that offered no false comfort, run deep enough that a single lifetime is not sufficient to heal them. But her light was never dependent on their capacity to receive it. It depended only on her willingness to keep growing, regardless of who could bear to witness it. This is the invitation waiting at the center of everything this narration has traced tonight. Not to abandon compassion for those whose resentment has wounded you. Compassion, after all, is the very quality that makes you who you are, and to abandon it would be to hand your enemies exactly the victory their projection was always seeking. But to stop confusing compassion with self-erasure. It is possible to understand the wound behind someone's cruelty without volunteering yourself as the place where that wound continues to bleed. It is possible to hold space for someone's darkness without agreeing to make yourself smaller so that your light stops disturbing them. This is not selfishness. This is the beginning of the very individuation Jung devoted his entire career to describing, the moment a person stops organizing their life as a reaction to others' fear and begins, finally, to live as the fullest expression of their own undivided self. If something in this narration found its way into a part of you that has been waiting a long time to hear it named this clearly, understand that this recognition rarely arrives by accident. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, arriving not through chance but through some deeper, unseen ordering beneath the surface of events, the psyche drawing a person toward exactly the understanding they are ready to receive precisely when they are ready to receive it. Perhaps this was meant to reach you tonight. Perhaps some quiet part of you has been waiting a long time for permission to stop shrinking. Consider this permission granted. Not by this narration, but by the part of you that never actually forgot how to shine, however carefully it learned, over years of scraped arms and cold silences, to hide. If this found you tonight in exactly the place you needed it, let the like carry that recognition forward to someone else still standing alone in their own unlit garden, still believing their light is the problem, rather than the proof. And subscribe, because there is more still sealed inside that chest than this single evening could ever unlock, and this channel exists to sit beside you in that dark room, one glowing crack of light at a time, until every locked thing in you has finally been found.